Do you believe a canine dog, once labeled untrainable, could recognize his former handler after 5 years apart with just one look? This isn't a fairy tale. It's a real story about a retired female soldier and the combat dog who once stood beside her under fire. A bond torn apart by time and military rules, but never erased. Some stories stick with you, not because they're dramatic, but because they're real. They make you stop and remember the four-legged friend who once walked beside you. If that resonates with you, you'll want to stick around here on Dog Stories, so don't forget to subscribe for more powerful moments just like this. Now, let's go back to a winter morning where two battle buddies finally meet again, after 5 years of silence. February in Minnesota is always colder than it needs to be. Wind howled through the pine trees out front, carrying bits of snow that stung like tiny needles. Lena Hartley stood still on the front porch, hands out of her pockets despite the numbness. Her eyes never left the silver SUV that had just pulled up to the gate. The back door creaked open. Inside was Brutus, the canine dog she had once trained, once bonded with, once trusted with her life. 5 years. No messages, no photos, not a single sign they would ever meet again. Lena took a breath, but not a deep one. Her lungs couldn't handle it like they used to. Part of it was time, part of it was war. People think wounds are what you can see, but the ones that hurt the most don't have names, like waiting. The car door creaked again. Julie, the woman in charge of the transport, gave a silent nod. "Get ready." Lena gave a slight nod, but deep down she wasn't sure she was ready. Brutus was let out of the vehicle. No muzzle, no tight leash. He moved slowly, heavily, no barking, no growling. Nothing like what they had warned her about. He's out of control now. He doesn't recognize his old handlers. You should keep your distance. But standing in front of Lena wasn't some wild animal. He was a worn-down warrior, steady, tired. Brutus stopped about 6 feet from her, ears pointed forward, eyes locked in, unblinking. Lena didn't move. They had told her, don't hold eye contact for too long. It could trigger aggression. But she didn't care. "Brutus," she said softly, though even she wasn't sure if she was calling him or calling back the version of herself from 5 years ago. A sharp gust of wind swept through, making Brutus step back half a pace. But then, unexpectedly, he moved forward. One step, then another, slow, steady. His head lowered slightly, tail down, closer still. Lena clenched her fists, partly from the cold, mostly because her heart was pounding like a war siren inside her chest. Brutus stopped right in front of her, still silent, still unreadable. And then he rested his head gently against her leg. No sound, no tears, just one deep breath that felt like it shattered her chest wide open. 5 years. Not a single word. But Lena knew, he remembered. She knelt down, placing one hand gently on his neck. Slow, steady, no hesitation. His coat was dark, coarse, but unmistakably familiar. It felt like retrieving a part of herself that had been cut away. Julie and Miles stood behind them, holding their breath. Everyone had heard of Brutus, the dog who nearly injured 3 soldiers. The dog labeled untrainable. But now here he was, resting at the feet of a woman. No muzzle, no leash, and peaceful. As if the distance had never existed. Lena said nothing more. She knew words would only get in the way. Those who've fought, who've lost, who've waited, they'd understand. Some things don't need explaining. Only the wind, the snow, and 2 shadows remained, one woman, one dog, cast long beneath the warm porch light in the stillness of a snowy night. 5 years ago, helicopter blades, dust in the air, and a pair of fierce eyes staring her down like a challenge. Brutus, day one of meeting him, was anything but easy. The blistering heat at Fort Belmont wasn't the worst part of Lena's first week on duty. What kept her up at night was a name she heard at least 8 times a day. Brutus. They didn't call him the dog. They spoke his name like he was on a red alert watch list. You're better off not making eye contact for too long. He doesn't like anyone in black uniforms. Don't ever turn your back when leaving his kennel. Brutus's reputation arrived long before he did. A large, powerful German Shepherd canine, with amber eyes that looked like they were always moments away from striking. What most didn't know was that he'd already been placed on the retirement watch list for being too aggressive. The week before Lena arrived, a rookie had his steel-toe boot punctured after casually patting Brutus's former handler on the shoulder. The bite didn't break skin, but the sound of metal cracking still sent chills down people's spines. No one wanted to train Brutus. They didn't believe he could be fixed. To them, Brutus was a combat machine that had gone off script. And Lena, the newcomer just transferred from a northern base, was assigned as his next handler. Think of it as a test run. The supervising sergeant told her, "If you can't handle him, we'll move him to behavioral review and close his file for good." Lena didn't respond. She just nodded and walked toward the row of kennels, where Brutus lay silently, as if the entire world outside didn't concern him in the slightest. When she stopped in front of kennel number 11, Brutus lifted his head. No barking, no growling, just a long, unblinking stare, so intense that anyone else might have turned away. But Lena didn't. "Hey there," she said, voice steady, not too loud, not too soft. "I'm Lena." The first few days felt like a silent psychological standoff. Brutus didn't bite her, but he didn't cooperate either. He wouldn't even glance at her when she gave commands. He didn't budge for training treats. Once he deliberately walked straight into a wall just to avoid making eye contact. The training crew started placing bets on how long Lena would last. Some said, "She'll quit in a week." Others said, "She's getting bit." But Lena didn't quit, and she didn't try to tame him either. She observed, took mental notes of every tiny reaction. Instead of telling him to sit, she sat first. Instead of commanding, she spoke, as if talking to another soldier. "You don't like being controlled, do you?" she said once, when Brutus refused to step into the training yard. "I don't like being ordered around either, but we've both got a job to do." On day 10, Brutus turned his head when she called his name, for the first time. On day 13, he followed her out of the yard. And on day 15, Lena placed her hand on his head without him tensing up. The battle wasn't fought through force, it was fought through silence and patience. And somehow, Brutus chose to trust her. After their 30th session, the behavior specialist came over and whispered, "He's never listened to anyone this long." Lena gave a faint smile. "I don't need him to listen, I need him to understand." They were soon assigned to off-base training missions, scent detection, reaction drills under simulated explosions, mobile target control. Brutus outperformed every other K9, as long as Lena was the one giving the orders. People started calling him something different, no longer the beast from Kennel 11, but Lena's Brutus. But even then, Brutus wasn't like other dogs. He didn't wag his tail, he didn't lick faces, he didn't curl up when he slept. He just did the job, and did it well, as if he knew it was the only thing keeping him in this world. Lena never asked why he changed. She didn't need a reason. But she believed it had something to do with how she looked at him. Not like a dog, but like a fellow soldier who'd been forgotten. And somehow, that reached the part of him no one else ever could. After 3 months of training at Fort Belmont, Lena and Brutus were deployed to a frontline operation in Hadira, a conflict zone in the Middle East where buried mines were as common as sand and gunfire never truly stopped for a full day. It was a place where trust was a luxury, and instinct could mean the difference between life and death for an entire unit. Brutus was assigned as a mine detection K9. Lena was his handler and coordinator. They weren't just a dog and handler pair anymore. They were an independent unit. One human, one dog, no one in between. 12 hours a day, they patrolled red dirt roads, inching through abandoned villages, crumbling warehouses, and silent fields that felt more haunted than empty. Lena held the leash. Brutus led, about 6 feet ahead, always just far enough to react fast, but close enough for Lee to read every tiny movement, every ear twitch, every sudden pause, even a change in breathing. Any of it could be a signal. And Lena learned to read Brutus the way someone would study a person's body language. One day, the heat was so brutal that the metal hinges on the Humvee were squealing. Their mission was to clear a narrow pathway between 2 buildings. The air was so still, Lena could hear the crunch of her boots pressing into the sand. Brutus led the way, as usual. Lena followed close, eyes locked on his every move. Halfway through the path, Brutus gave a quick flick of his right ear, a sharp, subtle twitch unlike anything he'd done before. He didn't stop completely, but his stride softened, slower, his head lowered closer to the ground. Lena got it instantly. She signaled a full stop. The team behind them came to a halt. "What's going on?" one of the soldiers asked. Lena didn't answer. She crouched down and drew a line in the sand beside Brutus's paw prints. Her eyes scanned the ground, then stopped. A faint line, thin as thread, stretched across the path between two dried bushes, a tripwire. The mine was buried right in the middle of the path, expertly hidden. If Brutus hadn't signaled with that tiny ear flick, the entire squad could have gone up in flames. After the bomb squad disarmed the device, the platoon leader clapped Lena on the shoulder. "How'd you know?" She pointed to Brutus, sitting calmly by her side. "It wasn't me. It was him." That wasn't the first time Brutus saved someone's life, and it wouldn't be the last. Over their 8-month deployment, they handled more than 40 similar incidents, at least 7 of them where Brutus detected danger before the electronic minesweepers did. What Brutus had couldn't be trained or replaced. It was a sixth sense, an instinct that felt almost supernatural. But what made it truly special was that it only came alive when he was with Lena. With others, Brutus could be cold, detached. With Lena, he was a walking radar. Every time the truck stopped, Lena stepped out first, Brutus followed. Every time the team rested, Brutus lay in front of her tent, never more than a few feet away. No one had to tell him what to do. He just knew where he belonged. They didn't talk much, obviously one human, one dog, but Lena always felt like Brutus could hear what she didn't say. When the stress got so heavy she couldn't sleep, all it took was her hand on his rough fur to steady her breathing. And it seemed like Brutus felt it too. Whenever distant explosions echoed through the dark, he would come sit beside her, quiet, unmoving, asking for nothing, like a sentry who needed no command. One night, after losing radio contact with command, Lena's unit had to take shelter in an old warehouse. No one slept. The whole squad was silent, just like the darkness pressing in around them. Brutus lay beside Lena. Suddenly, he lifted his head, ears up, eyes locked on the broken window. Lena placed her hand on her rifle. She didn't ask why. 2 minutes later, a strange sound echoed outside. A shadow moved past the back wall. No weapon visible. Could have been a civilian. Could have been something else. But in that moment, Lena understood. Brutus wasn't just a tool. He was a sensor, an instinct, a lifeline. And from that night on, her team stopped calling him the dog. They called him Brutus, the guard who never sleeps. The Hadira operation had no clear ending. No one said which day would be the last. Time was measured in weeks, in missions, in how many times you returned to base without anyone missing. Brutus and Lena kept moving forward in silence, step by step across a land where anything could explode at any time. One late afternoon, as fire-red sunlight swept across the southern Rock Hills, they received orders to clear a warehouse suspected of storing explosives. The team split into 2 groups. Lena and Brutus circled to the back, entering through a narrow passage, barely wide enough for 1 person and 1 dog. Brutus caught something. A scent. Sharp. Chemical. Wrong. He let out a low hiss. Lena tightened the leash and signaled, "Go." But just as Brutus surged forward, a sudden noise rang out from inside, metal clattering to the ground. Lena instinctively grabbed the leash and ran after him, feet slipping on sand-covered concrete. She couldn't keep her balance. Her body slammed hard into the concrete wall on the right. The impact wasn't loud. No one noticed. She got up, gritted her teeth through the pain, and kept going. Just a slip. Nothing serious. 2 days later, back at base, the pain hadn't gone away. If anything, it simmered like a fever deep under the skin. She started struggling to grip things with her right hand. A numbness crept into her neck and shoulder. Some mornings, she'd wake up unable to lift her arm. Lena kept it to herself for a week. Until one day, she dropped her rifle during an equipment check. She was ordered to see the medic. "You have a level 3 cervical disc herniation." The doctor said, "There's pressure on your central nerve." The medic's voice was steady, almost clinical, but every word hit like a hammer on steel. "You'll need surgery as soon as possible, and then long-term physical therapy. I'm sorry, Hartley, but your deployment ends here." Lena froze. What scared her wasn't the pain, wasn't the surgery. It was what came after. She had to leave, and Brutus wouldn't be allowed to go with her. In the military, canine dogs are considered federal property. They don't belong to any one person. Not even the handlers who trained them, bled beside them, lived and nearly died with them. By regulation, a soldier medically retired is not permitted to adopt a canine still on active duty. Lena tried everything. She filed requests, submitted appeals, she cited time served, mission records, even the lives Brutus had saved. But the answer never changed. No, he's still considered an active combat asset. Brutus stayed behind, still working, still completing missions, with someone else. As for her, she had to leave the unit within 3 days. On her final morning, Lena walked to Brutus's kennel. She wasn't allowed to take him out, only to look. Brutus stood there, ears alert as always, but his eyes weren't fixed on the inside of the kennel. They were locked on the hallway where Lena stood. She stepped closer slowly, as if trying to stretch out every last second. "I didn't think this would be how I'd say goodbye," she said, placing her hand on the cold metal gate. Brutus kept his gaze. He didn't step forward, didn't back away, didn't bark. But the look in his eyes hurt more than any physical injury she'd ever endured. Lena opened her mouth, maybe to make a promise, maybe to apologize, but nothing came out. She just lowered her head and whispered, "I've gone to war, I've held a rifle, but I've never felt more powerless than I do walking away from you." As she turned to walk away, her steps weren't rushed, but she didn't dare slow down either. Each footfall felt like it was pressing something deep down into a place no one could reach. Brutus didn't bark, didn't howl, didn't scratch at the gate like in the movies people always talk about. He just stood there, watching, until Lena's silhouette disappeared down the old hallway. The military vehicle rolled out of the base. Lena looked back through the rearview mirror, catching one last glimpse of the gates closing behind her. A world she once thought she'd never leave, now fading into a shadow. She didn't know what hurt more, the pain in her spine, or the hole Brutus had left behind. In the days that followed, lying in a hospital bed waiting for surgery, Lena kept replaying the sound of Brutus's footsteps, the rhythm of his breathing outside her tent, the sharp intelligence behind those silent eyes, and she found herself wondering, did he think about her, too? In the first few weeks after surgery, Lena hardly left the house. It was a small, single-story home, tucked on the edge of suburban Tulane, Minnesota, where winter arrived early, and the snow fell so thick it could silence the outside world completely. From behind the glass window, life moved by like a slow-motion film. School buses, wind slicing through rows of old pine trees, the faint clunking of the heating pipes as night settled in. Everything was calm, predictable, uneventful, and to Lena, that was more unsettling than any battlefield. She lived with a golden retriever named Murphy, a therapy dog recommended by the recovery center. Gentle, friendly, easygoing, and great for emotional support, they said. Murphy was a sweet companion, always finding ways to make people smile. But for Lena, that smile was usually just a reflex, never quite real. Brutus wasn't the kind of dog that made you smile. He was the kind that helped you survive. Lena started going back to school, studying neurological therapy. At first, it was just to keep her mind busy, like the doctor suggested. But the deeper she got into it, the more she began to understand the wounds she'd never been able to name. Class schedules, physical therapy, even part-time shifts at a rehabilitation center. On paper, everything looked fine. She had things to do, people to talk to. A well-behaved dog curled up at her feet every night. But there was a void nothing could fill. It had no clear shape, no name, only that every time she walked through the door, took off her shoes, and glanced toward the corner of the room, where she imagined a still, black shadow should be, her chest tightened just a little. Brutus had never laid there, but in her mind, that space had always belonged to him. She rarely talked about Brutus with anyone, because every time she did, someone would ask, "Where is he now?" And she had no way to answer that without her throat closing up. During a group therapy session for veterans, someone asked, "What's the one thing you miss most after leaving the military?" Some said they missed the sense of purpose. Others said the camaraderie. Lena just said one thing. "I talked to him more than I talked to anyone else during my 2 years in the military." The facilitator asked, "You mean Brutus?" She nodded. No one laughed. No one thought it was strange. In a room full of people who'd once lived on the edge of no man's land, everyone understood. Canine dogs aren't pets. They're teammates. Sometimes they're the only presence left when every other signal is lost. Every now and then, when snow blanketed her porch in silence, Lena would dream. She'd see Brutus, not the tense, mission-ready version, But Brutus, with his head lifted, ears relaxed, lying half asleep in a warm room, soft music playing in the background, sunlight streaming through the window. The dream never lasted long. But it lasted just enough to make her wake up with one question echoing in her chest. Is he okay? March in Minnesota was still cold. The sky hung gray, like a face that hadn't fully woken up, and snow still blanketed the front steps. Lena had just finished washing her hands after dinner when her phone buzzed softly. A message popped up from a familiar name. Joel Danner, an old teammate from Hadira, the one who'd handled tech support during their patrol missions. She frowned. They hadn't spoken in over 2 years. The message was just one line. Brutus is about to be retired. No one in the unit wants to take him. Do you? Lena froze in the kitchen, hands still wet. She read the message 3 times, as if her brain needed to double-check reality. Brutus. It had been 5 years since the day she walked out of that base without daring to look back. All that time she never asked, never reached out, because she knew. Brutus was government property. Once decommissioned, his future was never guaranteed. Now, that message was a door flung wide open, but not just to hope. There was an unspoken warning inside it. Lena replied instantly. What do you mean no one wants him? Joel answered a few minutes later. He's older now, harder to manage. A few people tried, but it didn't work out. If no one takes him, they might retire him permanently. She understood. In the K-9 world, retire him permanently was a softer way of saying, put him down. That reply cut like a thin blade across a wound that had never fully healed. Lena didn't need time to think. She made the call that same night, to a name she'd once come across on a veterans forum. Mission Pause, a group dedicated to reuniting retired working dogs with their former handlers. The phone rang exactly 3 times before a woman answered. Her voice was steady, clear, the kind that was used to urgent calls. This is Julie from Mission Pause. How can I help you? Lena gave a brief rundown of the situation, her voice slightly shaky, not from the cold, but from the emotion tightening her throat. Where is Brutus now? Julie asked. Air Force training facility in Arizona. And you? Minnesota, Tulane. Availability? I'm in school full-time. My schedule's packed Monday through Saturday, and financially, it's tight. There was a brief pause. Then Julie spoke, slow, steady, and crystal clear. Just give us the date. We'll bring your teammate home. No red tape, no need for more explanation. And for Lena, after 5 long years, that was the only thing she needed to hear. That night, she couldn't sleep. On the wall, Brutus's photo still hung in the middle of an old folder, a blurry shot taken during their final training session. His eyes squinted slightly from the sun, ears upright, a familiar training leash around his neck, the same one she unclipped for the last time on the morning they said goodbye. Lena sat staring at that photo, then picked up her phone and texted Julie, I don't know where this will lead, but I'm ready. Any day. The sooner, the better. The message went out at 2:14 a.m., and for the first time in years she felt like she had a mission again. A reason to get up, to wait, to hope. When Julie from Mission Pause confirmed the departure date, Lena felt like she'd just received new marching orders. Only this time, the mission had one name. Brutus. We're leaving Arizona on Friday. If all goes smoothly, we'll be in Minnesota by Sunday afternoon. Julie said over the phone. We're not flying. Brutus didn't respond well to jet engines before. This time, he's coming by road. Lena thanked her, trying to keep her voice steady. But the moment she hung up, she dropped into the chair, covered her face with both hands, and let out a long, deep breath, like she'd been holding it in for 5 years, and was finally allowed to exhale. From that moment on, time shifted into a different format. It wasn't measured in days or hours anymore. It became countdowns, 48 hours, 36 hours, 12 hours. She prepared everything as if welcoming home a long-lost family member. A large mattress laid out by the window, a brand-new stainless steel food bowl, a black leather collar and leash, not for control, but as a reminder. This wasn't a mission. This was coming home. Murphy, the golden retriever she lived with, seemed to pick up on the change in the air. He wasn't as playful as usual. He just followed Lena around, eyes tracking her every move. Like he was silently asking, "What's happening?" Lena stroked his head and whispered, "A big brother's coming home. You're gonna like him, unless you get scolded for being too loud." Meanwhile, the Mission Pause van was making its way across the country, mile by mile. They'd left Tucson, Arizona at 6 a.m., with Brutus riding in a private rear compartment, lined with padding, stocked with water and food. Julie was accompanied by a young volunteer named Miles, someone with experience working with canine dogs. The route wasn't easy. A snowstorm was moving north, blocking large portions of the interstate. The GPS lit up with delays. At one point, they had to reroute deep into Colorado off the main highway. Brutus didn't bark, didn't panic, but the tension was clear. His eyes stayed fixed in one direction, not forward, but behind him, toward wherever it was he'd just come from. During the second leg of the trip, Julie pulled over for a short break and sent Lena a quick update. "We're paused in Fort Morgan. Snow's starting. Might be a few hours late." Lena texted back, "Just get here. No rush." But the truth was, she was counting every hour, every minute. She didn't sleep. She never let her phone out of sight. She rewatched old training files, videos of Brutus sniffing out dummy bombs, leaping over barriers, jumping across jeeps. A blurry clip she'd secretly recorded once. Brutus asleep beside her tent, ears twitching with every sound, like his mind never stopped being on duty. On the second night, the snow in Minnesota began to fall heavier. Lena took her old military jacket, folded it neatly, and laid it in the center of the small bed she'd prepared. Next to it, she placed a short letter, no envelope. "If you still remember me, then I'm still here. And this time, I'm not going anywhere." Sunday morning. A message came in at 9:48 a.m. "We're entering the edge of Duplain. See you at 11. Be ready." Lena didn't reply. She set her phone down and leaned against the wall. Her whole body felt caught in a spasm of emotion. Excitement, anxiety, joy, fear. Would Brutus still recognize her? Would he even want to come home? Murphy barked once, sharp, cutting through her spiral of thoughts. Lena looked out the window. Light snow was falling. A silver SUV was slowly turning onto her driveway. The journey was over, or maybe it was just about to begin. The silver SUV rolled to a slow stop in front of the porch. Its tires pressed softly into the fresh snow, leaving behind 2 long tracks, leading straight to this moment, and maybe to everything Lena had been waiting for these past 5 years. The door opened. Julie stepped out first. Thick gloves, a beanie slightly askew over her dark brown hair. Her face didn't show much expression, but her eyes said it all. "Ready?" Lena nodded, though her heart wasn't. No one who's ever worn the uniform is ever truly ready for a moment this fragile. The rear door opened. Miles, the volunteer, gave Julie a quick signal. They exchanged a few fast words, then both turned to the back of the vehicle. A sharp clack cut through the quiet, the sound of the latch unhooking on the containment gate. And then Brutus stepped out. Same jet black coat, now dusted with silver around the muzzle. Same solid frame, walking slow but sure. And those eyes, the same eyes that once cut through battlefield dust, the ones that made Lena trust without needing a radar. But this time, he wore a muzzle. Julie gently guided the leash, walking toward Lena with the care of someone escorting a soldier home. "Just for safety," she whispered. "He's still adjusting." Brutus stopped a few steps away. He didn't bark. He didn't leap forward. There were no over-the-top reactions like the reunion videos that flood social media. No whining, no yelping, no tailspin of joy. Brutus just stood there, watching, not with aggression, not with emotion, but like he was running a scan, sorting, pulling up memory files. Lena held his gaze. She didn't speak. She didn't raise her hand. She simply stood there, the way she once had in front of Kennel 11, all those years ago. 1 beat, 2 beats. Brutus tilted his head slightly. Ears perked, his eyes blinked, slow and deliberate. Lena stepped forward, 1 step, 2. Miles glanced at Julie and gave a subtle nod. Julie said nothing. She simply let go of the leash, letting it fall softly to the ground. Brutus still didn't move. Lena crouched down, slow, careful. Her hand reached for the muzzle. Her heart was pounding so loud, she swore someone else might hear it. "All right, soldier," she whispered. "If you still remember me, then let's go home." A soft click broke the silence. The muzzle came off. In that moment, the air seemed to freeze. No one breathed, no one spoke. Brutus lifted his head, no growl, no bark, no flinch. He sat gently, steadily. Then he walked toward Lena, not fast, not slow. 1 step, then another, until he was just an arm's length away. Brutus stopped. His eyes softened. No longer the eyes of a hardened warrior that made others uneasy. no longer the guarded stare of a creature bound by rules and orders, just the eyes of an old friend, one who had been through war, had endured distance, and now simply wanted to make sure this wasn't a dream. Lena knelt down. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. Brutus took half a step closer and laid his head gently on her leg. No words, no commands. No one needed to say a thing. He was still her teammate. Julie quietly turned and walked back toward the car. Miles took a deep breath, then moved to the trunk to grab their gear, leaving behind a silent space for the two figures in the snow, one standing, one kneeling. Murphy, the golden retriever inside, was watching through the window, but he didn't bark. It was as if he understood too. Something sacred was unfolding out there. Lena didn't wipe her tears. She let them fall, slowly, quietly. Brutus stayed where he was, head resting on her leg. Still. Steady. Neither of them wore the uniform anymore. But they had never stopped being soldiers, never stopped being a team. There were no selfies, no videos for the internet, no explanations needed. Just two souls who had walked through darkness, now reunited in the quiet light of a winter morning. For the first 3 days, Brutus didn't sleep. Not because he was anxious, not because the place felt unfamiliar. He dozed in quick bursts, eyes half open, ears twitching non-stop. The moment a car horn sounded or wind slammed against the window, he'd spring to his feet, as if he were back in some abandoned warehouse in the middle of a mission. Lena understood. She'd been the same after discharge. It took her a year to sleep without wearing boots, 3 years to eat without checking the time. Survival reflexes don't vanish just because you've left the place that taught you how to survive. Brutus carried them too, every sliver of routine, every layer of hyper-awareness, as if the war were still just outside the front door. A week passed, and slowly, change began. Quiet, gradual, but unmistakable. On the 5th morning, Lena woke up at 6 a.m. like usual. But Brutus wasn't waiting at the bedroom door like he had every other day. She stepped out, looked around, and found him curled up by the fireplace, fast asleep. So deep in rest, he didn't even stir at the creak of the floorboards. It wasn't exhaustion, it was trust. For the first time, he believed he was safe. Lena laid down a brand new wool rug, deep gray, right by the hearth. "Place of honor," she said, gently stroking his head. "You don't have to earn it. You already have." From that day on, that rug was Brutus's spot. No one stepped on it. No other dog dared to get too close. Murphy, the ever-cheerful golden, once tried to creep over, curious, but with just a tilt of Brutus's head, he understood. This wasn't territory to be challenged. Even so, Brutus never growled. He didn't need to. He simply set boundaries, like an older brother with quiet authority. One quiet Saturday afternoon, the snow had begun to melt under a rare burst of sunlight. Lena slipped on her coat and fastened Brutus's collar, not for warmth but out of habit, the kind of ritual that never left her. They stepped into the woods. The trail behind the house opened into an old path lined with tall pine trees, silent, sparse, untouched. Murphy ran ahead, nose to the ground, tail wagging like a propeller. Brutus was different, steady, unhurried, unmoved by sense or sound. Lena walked beside him. No leash, no commands. They just walked. Cold wind whispered through the treetops. Sunlight cut across her shoulder, scattering soft beams over the forest floor. Lena didn't speak. Brutus didn't need to look up, but every step they took seemed to follow the same invisible rhythm, as if they were moving to a song only the two of them could hear. At a small ridge overlooking the thawed lake, Lena stopped. Brutus stopped too. He sat, lifted his head, and looked out over the water, silent, still. No alertness, no glancing back, no waiting for orders. He just sat. For the first time, Lena saw him truly rest, not just his body but his mind. Someone once said that military dogs never stop working, even in retirement, but Lena didn't believe that. Brutus was still doing his duty. It had just changed. It wasn't sniffing out bombs anymore or standing guard or keeping anyone alive. His mission now was to let himself live like a regular being, a dog, a soldier who'd done his time. And finally, was home. Late in the afternoon, sunlight poured sideways through the window, casting a soft golden layer across the floor. Brutus lay on the rug, his head resting on Lena's leg, eyes half closed. He wasn't asleep, just soaking in the peace, like someone who had finally reached the end of a long, hard road. Lena sat reading an old book, her hand resting gently on his head. Every time she touched that coarse fur, it felt like she was reaching into a part of her past. Something she thought had been lost forever, but somehow found its way back to her in the most unexpected way. Brutus isn't a soldier anymore, she said, as if speaking to someone just out of frame. But to me, he's still my comrade. She didn't need him to do anything. No guarding, no tracking. He didn't have to fight, didn't have to follow orders. And maybe that's why his presence now, in this quiet, ordinary space, felt more valuable than ever. Not because of duty, not because of a role, but because of friendship. Each morning, Lena and Brutus walked around the lake, where the still water mirrored their shapes, one human, one dog, moving side by side slowly, peacefully. Some friends don't need words, she once said. Just walking next to each other is enough. One day, a neighbor asked her, "What makes you so attached to him? Is it because he saved you?" Lena simply smiled and shook her head. "No, it's because when I lost everything, my job, my health, my sense of direction, he was still in my mind. And when Brutus came back, it felt like a piece of myself I thought I left on the battlefield had finally come home." She never said she rescued him. She never called it taking him back. To Lena, Brutus didn't need saving. He just needed to return to where he belonged. No one gets left behind. That's what the military always says. But what many forget is that should apply to canines too. They didn't choose to fight. They didn't choose to sacrifice. But they did, with a level of loyalty no human could ever truly replicate. Brutus was once part of war, Lena said. Now, he's part of peace. My peace. If you've ever had a friend like Brutus, not necessarily a war dog, not even a soldier, just someone who stood by you through your hardest days, share your story in the comments. We'd love to hear it. Because who knows, your story might be exactly what someone else needs to believe, that friendship never retires. And if you want to hear more true stories about four-legged friends, the brave, the loyal, the ones who truly deserve our respect, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Dog Stories. We're grateful for your support. Always. Here we don't just tell stories to be heard, we tell them to be felt.